In this episode, we'll chat about the improvements you can make to your draft teams ahead of Game Week 6. Welcome back to the Draft FC podcast, the podcast website and YouTube channel dedicated to all things official draft FPL. My name is Mitch and I'm your host for another Game Week preview, going over waiver options, hidden gems and general Premier League chat ahead of Game Week 6. Now, not really many surprising results, if any, in Game Week 5. A few tight contests culminating in that epic battle between City and Arsenal on Sunday evening. The biggest news there really was an injury concern, which we will discuss. Otherwise, there were a few lineup surprises ahead of another week of both domestic and European Cup competitions. So, it's going to be some head scratching again, trying to work out who will be in the lineups for this weekend. Big news for Draft FC members. I know lots of you have been asking us for a few weeks now, and it was long overdue getting the new squad planner out to you. That has now been loaded onto the site. It's definitely version 1.0, but we wanted to get it out there to let you guys have a play. So see what you think about it. Taz has been working very, very hard to get it up to where it is now. It's far better than I actually thought it was going to be. He's gone above and beyond what we actually discussed as far as I was aware. Still some improvements to be made, and as I say, we just wanted to get it out there, let you guys play with it. Any suggestions or feedback, then of course, give us a shout. Now, I'm recording this episode on Tuesday the 24th of September, so any team news, injury developments or press conference info are up to date as of then, and of course, subject to change. Some of the players I'll be discussing in this episode include Ward-Prowse, Adama Traore, Raul Jimenez, plus many more. So let's get straight into it. So a reminder, the waivers will process again on Friday the 27th at 11 a.m. ahead of the main game week deadline on Saturday at 11 a.m. too. Let's start by having a look at Waiver Watch, the players that were moving in and out of your draft teams last week. This data, of course, as always, powered by the data we have at Draft FC, which is completely available to Draft FC members. So the players coming in, starting with McNeil, who I suspected after his haul the week before, Aina, Harvey Barnes, De Ligt, Sanchez, Duran, Sells, Vardy, Raul Jimenez, Jadon Sancho after his good performance, and Joel Veltman. So generally some good moves there. The players making way were Rodrigo Muniz, Vissa, Steele, Doku, João Felix, Neto, Gusto, Fulkrug, Zinchenko, Munoz and Henderson. Some okay drops, some not so good drops there. I guess the Palace drops in Henderson and Munoz, not ideal after they got a 0-0. Otherwise, some reasonable ones in there. Let's move on to the fixtures. So if we're just looking at Game Week 6, the fixtures I like in particular are Crystal Palace away at Everton, and I also like Brentford at home to West Ham. West Ham in particular, I watched their game against Chelsea on Saturday lunchtime, and I thought West Ham looked very poor. I think it's the first full West Ham game that I've watched so far this season. I've heard that they haven't been playing particularly well, but it was really evident in that game. A lot of it was structural. They lined up with Alvarez in the centre of a back three for the first half an hour, and he looked completely out of his depth, and it disrupted the positioning really of everyone else. Rodriguez was essentially then left to be a one-man midfield. He was then chucked under the bus because he was hauled off after about half an hour. He was just chasing shadows essentially, but could easily have been Alvarez that got substituted off, and purely a sacrifice to spare Lopetegui from taking all the blame, as he should do. Souček came on and sort of shored things up a little bit. They went to a more conventional back four, but it was kind of a bit too late by then. Emerson continues to look bang average for me, so I'm not watching West Ham every week, but he was sort of already on my radar as a weak link, and that certainly hasn't changed after that game. There was a break in around the 14th, 15th minute. West Ham were only 1-0 down at that point, and it broke with Emerson down the left, and you could see none of the West Ham players were particularly interested in making a run because they just kind of knew nothing was going to come off it. Kudus, who should have been breaking his neck on the opposite flank, was just kind of jogging with his head down. Bowen as number 9, I never really liked the look of. It certainly didn't work in that game. Possibly the worst game I've seen Bowen play for West Ham in a full match, and he really only stayed on the pitch based on his reputation. He should have been subbed off for Antonio when Somerville was, and that change when Somerville was taken off brought a load of boos from the home fans. So they're going to need a massive performance. Brentford as well will be looking for a bounce back after their defeat to Spurs. But Brentford at home to West Ham. I fancy Brentford in that one. And as we'll discuss again in this episode, I do still like the look of a couple of their attacking options in the absence of Johan Visser. In terms of slightly longer term, as you can see there, I like a lot of the teams that I did from last week. Villa, Chelsea, Liverpool and Ipswich in their good runs. Teams in not so good runs, Wolves seem to constantly be in a bad run, and the runs always look harder when you're not playing particularly well. Fulham, not a great little trio there. Forest away, City away, Villa at home, and Brighton now also moving into a pretty shoddy run. I've put them as a bank of 6 there. There is a home game against Wolves in the middle, but around that, Chelsea away, Spurs at home, Newcastle away, Liverpool away, Manchester City at home. That's one of the toughest 6-game runs you're going to see for any team all season. So any of their non-season keepers really could be dropped for a decent little chunk there in favour of players with better fixtures and better form. Now, key injuries and suspensions to talk about. And the 2 big injuries we've had this week, one not so relevant and one potentially very relevant to our draft teams. Mosquera, who emerged in the first team for Wolves this season, went off in that game at the weekend with what's been confirmed as a nasty knee injury, which will rule him out for the rest of the season. Bigger news is Rodri for Manchester City. Now, before we come on to him, the other one I obviously should have put on here is Leandro Trossard, who got sent off, so he will be suspended for the next match. But the big news is Rodri. Going to be a huge miss for Manchester City. We haven't had it fully 100% confirmed yet, but from the images and from some of the early reports, looks like he may have done injury to his ACL, which again will likely rule him out for the rest of the season at this stage. So, yeah, I mean, I said in pre-season that I really like Rodri as a draft asset in his own right. He chips in with a lot of attacking returns considering his position on the pitch. So Rodri himself is obviously a clear drop, so that will free up some waivers for a lot of managers out there. The bigger news, and we'll kind of touch on it with some of the main picks later on, is the knock-on effect that has for the rest of the Manchester City squad. I expect we'll see far more of Kovacic. So for those of you that liked the look of him in the first couple of weeks, I was obviously telling people to drop him because he's not really a draft asset. He will very much be playing a lot more minutes than he may have done had Rodri not sustained that injury. But it then has a knock-on effect to the defenders and the attackers. We don't really know what they're going to do within the squad to combat that loss, because I think just playing Kovacic where you would play Rodri is definitely not like for like, and there needs to be more of a structural coverage there. Whether that's someone like John Stones playing a little bit more in holding midfield, or whether we continue to see Rico Lewis stepping up, though he seems to be a bit more progressive and a bit more advanced than someone like John Stones would sit and do a bit more of a disciplined job. Not to say John Stones can't get forward either, but yeah, it could trigger a complete structural formation change to how we've seen City largely set up in a kind of a 3-2-4-1 in their build-up. Time will tell on that, really. Say Pep, I'm sure, will not panic and will have some sort of answer up his sleeve that he will have devised, and it'll be interesting really to see how that plays out. But let's get into some of the main picks. Just the one defender to mention, who I've mentioned on a few already now, and that's Mazraoui, who I'm a big fan of. Another clean sheet in that match away at Crystal Palace. His ownership in 10-team leagues has rocketed to 98% now, 70% in 8-team leagues, so he's available in around a third of leagues there. Also, definitely not how you spell Mazraoui for those watching on the video. But yeah, out of all of the new defenders to appear in the game this season, Mazraoui feels like the one very much on the verge who could be knocking on the door of that premium defender category. So I do like United defensively generally, so I think there will be enough clean sheets there. Just remains to be seen how much he can chip in with attacking returns. So the team still isn't particularly settled. It's getting closer to being a settled starting 11. I think we're getting very close to seeing what Ten Hag kind of wants it to be there, which will favour everyone for United. But yeah, Mazraoui is definitely someone. I think if you're in an 8-team league and he's free, even though you could argue the next game isn't exactly a clean sheet on paper, I still think he's a good long-term pick. And then midfielders, we said it in pre-season and you can see it every week so far. It really is midfielders galore in the waivers at the moment. Still just so many good options out there. These are all the players with generally quite high ownership, starting with Ward-Prowse, who he's not really been one I've been particularly keen on. I didn't love him getting the move to Forest. I didn't think it did him particularly well as a draft asset. But we saw Gibbs-White get sent off last week, 2 yellow cards. He's another one that will miss game week 6. Could potentially miss more than that because he's been charged with his reaction after the sending off, which seems to be a bit of a recurring theme so far this year. So they're clearly clamping down on those reactions after being sent off. Obviously, in his absence, someone needs to fill the hole, and I think Ward-Prowse is now very safe to play if he wasn't already. Could play a bit more of a pivotal role in the attack, the set pieces, etc. A home game against Fulham this week means he's a decent 1-week punt. Could stretch a little bit further if he displays well at the weekend, but just an option. I know there are lots of you out there that still put a lot of value in the brand that is Ward-Prowse's name. Not one I'll be targeting in the waivers this week, but if you were doing it as a 1-week punt, I wouldn't argue against it. Barnes is another one that seems to constantly be on the list. Another goal at the weekend in what was overall a pretty shoddy performance from Newcastle, and their performances, or their results rather, has kind of finally caught up with the poor performances. Not a great day out next week against Manchester City, but Barnes, even in 8-team leagues, is more than good enough to be in somebody's midfield. Semenyo getting a lot of love in normal FPL circles at the moment. Good underlying numbers, good on the eye. A nice home game against Southampton in game week 6. Ownership just 50% in 8-team leagues. So for half of you listening, possibly not half of you listening, because I guess the engaged leagues will have nabbed him already. But yeah, again, similar to Barnes, he has to be in somebody's midfield in an 8-team league. Savio, we saw get another assist this season for Erling Haaland's goal against Arsenal. Owned in just a third of 8-team leagues, and also some ownership there in 10-team leagues too. As I said, the injury to Rodri throws a bit of a cat amongst the pigeons. They lined up with both Doku and Savio as their very conventional direct wingers in that game against Arsenal. Whether they feel comfortable doing that moving forwards, I mean, you'd have to say if they feel comfortable playing the two of them against Arsenal, there isn't a huge amount of reason why they couldn't do that against more teams. I guess the big reason would be why they felt comfortable doing that against Arsenal was because they had Rodri sitting there as the number 6. So I say it's one of those where, if they want to continue being that direct and having Doku and Savio playing, Doku and Savio's stocks could rocket up. If they decide to go a bit more conservative and fill it out with the likes of Bernardo Silva, Gundogan, KDB, Foden, perhaps only play one or all the other of Savio or Doku, then it could see their stock sink a little bit. So an interesting one. I'm a big fan of him. I think he's settled in really well so far. And if he was available in my own waiver pile, I would certainly be looking to bring him in. The final one on the list is Adama Traore. This must be pretty much an all-time high ownership for him, even going back to his Wolves days. He leads the way in expected goal involvements for Fulham at 2.5 so far, which is ahead of Smith Rowe, who's on 2. An away trip to Forest before a much trickier run after that. A good option for the upcoming game week if you don't want to plan any further than that. Reece Nelson obviously came off the bench and scored at the end as well in their last match. So I think it's only going to take one characteristically poor performance from Adama Traore and another good showing from Reece Nelson off the bench, and we could see a start for Nelson any week now. And then in attack, we mentioned him already because he was on that most waived in list, is Raul Jimenez. 2 starts and 2 goals now. And my faith in Rodrigo Muniz is well and truly shaken. Ironic, given last week's draft duel between him and DCL, and yet even though this feels like a terrible time to be holding Muniz, he was still able to sign off that game with an assist. Raul took his goal at the weekend incredibly well. Just the sort of finish that solidifies a starting spot because it was confident, deadly, and just the sort of finish of a striker in very good form. I hate to do the direct switch from Muniz to Raul. That's probably because it feels like a dent to my own ego, but it's hard objectively to argue against making that move if it presents itself to you. If Muniz were to suddenly get a start and a goal out of the blue, it will change on a sixpence, and Muniz will get picked up again by someone at the bottom of your league so fast you won't have time to regret it. But I think for now, especially given there are a lot of strikers out there that you could be holding that aren't getting minutes, making that switch, it seems sensible. And then Duran, who's just permanently etched into the slides on here. 4th goal in 5, another one off the bench. They are playing Wycombe in the EFL Cup as I'm recording this, and he starts that game, which would probably indicate he's going to be benched again for the weekend in their away game at Ipswich. They have 2 home games then against Bayern Munich and then United the week after, so it'll put much more of a stretch on their squad, and we may yet see our first league start for Duran in that game against Man United. Either way, his ownership continues to rise every week. 99% owned in 10-team leagues now is pretty universal, and the 8-team leagues are catching up too. So let's move on to our new segment, not brand new, but reasonably new segment, Draft Duel. A few of you messaged about the name. We had one suggestion for an alternative name, which off the top of my head, I can't remember what it is now, but on the whole, it seemed favourable towards Draft Duel. So we're going to keep it as Draft Duel for the time being. Loads of suggestions for the players. I'll probably do it every week because it's the best way really to work out who the players are in everyone's minds out there. What I would say, just for those who request in future, it is just one player versus another player. So don't list 3 or 4 names. It's just A versus B. And ideally, I don't want them to be on the same team. I'm not saying it's an absolute rule, but yeah, so just in future, if I ask for suggestions, just wanting 2 players to directly compare. Now, the most common players that came up this week, probably Garnacho. We had Garnacho and Bailey, Garnacho and Amad Diallo. We had that twice, in fact. The other player that was quite popular was Martinelli and Szoboszlai, Martinelli and Schade, Martinelli and Nkunku. So I thought, why not? Let's do Garnacho versus Martinelli. Both wingers for big teams. Both carry some pedigree in FPL and both not exactly living up to expectations so far. Both drafted very similarly on draft day. Martinelli was at 37 overall and Garnacho at 40, which in draft terms is no difference at all. So it's pretty much identical draft day value there. Let's start by looking at Garnacho. So last year we really saw the full emergence of Garnacho into the United first team, going from 5 starts in the 22-23 season to 30 starts last year. 2,500 minutes, 7 goals, 7 assists from an FPL perspective, though only 4 proper assists if you're looking at any other sites. He's only just turned 20 years old, so the ceiling for him over the next few years really is as high as he wants to build it. So far this season, the minutes have been much more patchy, and he's only started 2 of the 5 league games that they've had so far. Some of that was due to his international duties over the summer and lack of a pre-season over the likes of Rashford and Amad Diallo, who were around all summer. And some of that remains because Ten Hag still doesn't really know who his best 11 is. So I think we're getting closer to it now, as I said, and I still believe Garnacho is very much in their best 11. Last season, he was not as clinical as he could have been. He had a very high expected goal involvement per goal involvement ratio of 1.44. And for context, just to compare, everyone rightly laughs at Darwin Núñez for squandering chances. His ratio for that same stat was 1.32. So Garnacho's was even worse than Darwin's was. I think by game week 10, we will know how the United squad is being used this season. And based on his recent numbers, I think we can expect between 12 and 17 returns this season. Now, that's quite a wide range. And that variation really comes down to whether or not he can improve his chance conversion rate and get his output similar to his underlying stats. It's also dependent on him getting roughly similar minutes to what he did last year, which, as I said, I'm still confident he will do. Let's move on to Martinelli, another player, as I said, with a slow start. He's really fallen off quite a bit in the last year or so. In the 22-23 season, he finished on 198 FPL points with the expectation that he would go on last season to kind of get his 200-point badge and get into that club, but it just didn't materialise. 22-23, he registered 15 goals and 9 assists, but last year scraped to just half of that in terms of attacking returns. An obvious excuse here is injury. He missed 3 games the season before last, but missed around 10 last year through injury, so that will obviously have put a dent in his output. As well as all this, we also saw the emergence, particularly in the back end of last season, of Leandro Trossard. as he was coming up as a real clutch player on the left side, and so Martinelli's favour dipped a bit, and he then kind of scraped his way to a relatively mediocre 118 FPL points for the season. So far this year, it remains clear that he is still, for now at least, a starting 11 player, and he started 4 of their opening 5 Premier League games. The attacking returns, however, have not been forthcoming. He has just 1 assist so far, which came from Calafiore's goal, a goal that had 0.02 XG against Manchester City on Sunday. And his underlying stats from the opening 5 as a whole don't really suggest he's been missing out. So at his current rate of FPL points, he's projected a season very similar to the one that he had last year. If we look at previous seasons, he's never been one really to smash through his expected stats, and didn't put up particularly exciting expected goal involvement to goal involvement ratio last year at 1.25. He's obviously better than Garnacho's, but in the grand scheme of things, and as you'll have seen in the tables I've done over the last couple of weeks already, by no means an elite level. If to be elite, really, you want it to be 1 or below. So 1.25 last season wasn't particularly great. Now, when projecting players, you know that I'm very heavy on expected minutes. And for Martinelli, the landscape doesn't really look any better than it did last year, and arguably looks worse with the arrival of Raheem Sterling. Now, a red card for Trossard last week helps his cause for this coming weekend, at least. But over the season, there are going to be plenty of opportunities for him to be benched. And if he continues at this kind of rate of form, it's going to be difficult really to justify a kind of continual starting spot in the team, especially when they'll have Trossard and Sterling to come on and do some stuff if they need to. Based on his expected rate of return and minutes this season, I've got his attacking return somewhere between 10 and 13, and we should know, I reckon, by the end of game week 8, where he's likely to fall, given the sort of 3 upcoming fixtures for Arsenal, which are very favourable. So my verdict, if you were offering these 2 players to me right now, I would take Garnacho. I think macro view, he is in the ascendancy. The minutes so far don't bother me particularly. I think he's better than Rashford, Amad Diallo, Antony, and whoever else they could play high and wide. Martinelli is in a very difficult patch. So it stretches back a considerable chunk of games now, and extra competition for his starting spot doesn't really help his value. Because of the season he had the one before last, and the fact that he's a big name for a title contender, he still holds trade value. And that's probably your best move with him right now. That's certainly what I'd be looking to do if I had him. In terms of who you might trade for directly, Garnacho himself is an option. Leon Bailey, a Chelsea attacker that you particularly like, excluding Palmer, Semenyo, Mitoma, one of the City wingers. It will always depend, obviously, on the rest of your squad and making sure that there's the right appetite for risk and the balance is there. But I think now is as good a time as any to offer him out the back of an attacking return, rather than the manager clicking on his stats and just seeing a whole load of zeros. At least there is a 1 in there now. The other gamble you can make is holding him for 1 or 2 more weeks and seeing if he can notch a goal or something. But at that point, you might get yourself too shook to even drop him in the first place. So personally, I'd be looking to move him out ASAP if the value's there with a fellow manager in your league. Let's move on to hidden gems then, and we won't go into these in as much details. A couple of defenders, Alex Moreno for Forest. I like him as a player, and I like Forest as a defensive unit, actually. It's not been the most solid so far, and obviously a bit of a tricky one last week away at Brighton, but a good home game against Fulham. He's definitely an option and someone that you could look to hold for a bit longer. And Diego Carlos, Villa still in their good run. We've seen Bogard dropped, which to me would be the right move. Diego Carlos now is coming in at centre-back, with Konsa moving over to right-back. So just another option, really, if you want a bit of the Villa defence, or if your head-to-head matchup this week has someone like Pau Torres or Konsa and you want to match them up. In midfield, Schade and Carvalho remain there at the top of the list as they were last week. Now, Carvalho started, Schade didn't. Most of that, again, is tactical because they set up with only two out-and-out attackers, really, in Carvalho and Brian Mbeumo against away at Spurs. A home game this week against West Ham, I think we'll see them set out in their more conventional 4-3-3, and I expect Schade to start as their number 9 in that one, especially if you look at the goals that West Ham conceded against Nico Jackson on Saturday. They will just be hopefully just showing Schade that tape and trying to replicate those in their own match. Carvalho, I like just if you want a piece of the action there, but I still prefer Schade, even though he didn't get the start against Spurs. Now, after Watkins and Duran, the player currently in third space for expected goal involvements is Yuri Tielemans, a smidge ahead of Rodgers, who himself earned a bit of a reprieve with a couple of assists last week, which means a lot of managers will now be keeping him. My advice might be see what trade value you can get for Morgan Rodgers this week, and if you still want a piece of the action for Villa, you can then go and replace him with Tielemans out of the waivers. Souček currently leads the way in XG for West Ham, well clear of the rest. Should start the next game away at Brentford, and probably more one for the larger leagues if you fancy him to go and get his head on a free kick or corner. Someone that might have a bit more excitement for you is Mavididi for Leicester. Very low ownership across most leagues. 2 starts in a row now, 2 goals. He's not been included in the 11 for their game against Walsall as we speak, which is a positive signal for draft managers that he's, for now at least, in the Premier League first 11. Not an ideal match away at Arsenal this weekend, but one to keep an eye on, and one particularly for larger leagues if they're interested. And then the final midfielder just to list there is Gundogan. He started that game against Arsenal. Didn't particularly shine too brightly, but could be a real winner in the absence of Rodri. If they go with a more of a flat back 4 and a more conventional sitting 2, you could easily see Kovacic and Gundogan sitting there. Whether that means you want him as a draft asset, you could argue not if he's going to be sitting a lot more deeper, but he's played that role plenty of times before for City and can still arrive very nicely in the box and get his goal returns on his day. So another one to keep an eye on, and I know lots of you rushed to get him when he first entered the game. So if he's someone that you have a lot of value in still and think he could be a winner from the Rodri injury, then now might be the week to pick him up. And then a couple of forwards. Archer has come in and stayed in the team, didn't play very well, missed 1 or 2 big chances in their last game. So not one I'm massively interested in, but he is a playing striker at very low ownership if you need one. Bit more excitement for Ndiaye. Took his goal really well in that match against Leicester. And in one of my draft teams, I brought him in this week. I'm having some pretty good luck with my forward moves. I had Vardy come in for a goal, and now Ndiaye come in for a goal as well. A home game against Palace. Everton desperate to get a win on the board. Palace at home isn't exactly the easiest one to go and break down, but I like Ndiaye as a playing forward option who I think will get a handful of goals this season if he can get a bit of a run going. But if he gets a run going, could turn into a really useful player. Most hidden gem pick this week is a good one as they go. It's definitely a good one. And it's Tyler Dibling for Southampton. Probably the easiest most hidden gem pick I'll do all season. Potentially the talisman for Southampton has properly entered the scene. Second start in a row now for the 18-year-old attacker. Very little in the way of background stats because of his age, but a lot of very excited Southampton fans to base the selection from. A very classy goal against Ipswich, the control, the composure in the box, and then a finish that really any elite striker would be proud of. If this is the first of him you're hearing about, believe me, he's nailed on to start, as Southampton need any ounce of a spark they can find at the moment. An option for smaller leagues too, with, a South Coast derby at Bournemouth in Game Week 6, and Leicester at home the week after next in Game Week 8. So, if you were looking at a 1, 2, 3 week punt in your 8 or 10 team league, definitely a name that not many other managers in your league will be looking at, especially if you're prioritising your moves and you're more interested in prioritising a forward or a defender. Tyler Dibling is the sort of waiver you could pencil in right at the bottom of your list, reasonably confident that not many other managers may be looking at him and you can still just scoop him up with good priority elsewhere. Just 6% rostered in 16-team leagues. That will absolutely rocket over the next week or two. Yeah, and a player that I'm really interested in watching, which isn't as much as I can say for near enough any other player in the Southampton squad. On to the get rid list, and a list really that I sort of cultivate and add to and remove from. Kovacic is off it. I've added Kamada. He was used as more of a deeper lying midfielder in the United game, which didn't work at all. I think it was a bit of an admission from Glasner that he's not really as good to get in over Eze and Nketiah or even Sarr in one of those more advanced attacking positions. I think it was a way just to try and shoehorn him in, and it really didn't work. Decore was injured, and they needed someone like Lerma in there just to be a bit more of a battler. Haven't added him to the list for those watching, but Breton Diaz obviously got dropped, and I don't think we can afford to hold any Southampton player that's a minute's risk. And the other one, of course, is Rodri that we have to put on the get-rid list, unfortunately, for him. So, yeah, as I said, look at it as an opportunity. He's not someone that was going to make or break your season, so go and have a look for someone with a bit more upside in the waiver pile. Predicted lineups. We haven't had a flick through our predicted lineups for a couple of weeks now because I've been short of time, but let's have a quick flick through them this week. Let's cut to draftfc.co.uk. So these are the lineups that are there for anybody that's passing by, so you don't need to be a signed up member. As I've said many times though, the predicted lineups that are accessible in the members area are a lot better than this, and use a lot of your league specific data and superimpose that directly onto these lineups, so you can quickly see just from glancing at them who's available, who's taken, their expected points for the coming week. Really easy planning at a glance if you haven't got a lot of time. So for Arsenal, we didn't see White. There's an injury doubt on White. There's also an injury doubt on Raya. So we saw Calafiore come in and Timber move over to right back. They've obviously got good coverage there now, so it didn't harm them too much. Then remains to be seen, obviously, how they start filling out in midfield. Now, currently I've got a sneaky that they play Gabriel Jesus. Otherwise, it could be a first start for Raheem Sterling, which I had a sneaky suspicion they could do against City, but we didn't see it. We'll see how the week develops. They've got a midweek game, so if Sterling plays 90 minutes in that, or if Jesus plays 90 minutes in that, and Sterling's rested, but then again, I don't think they've really got quite enough attacking options at the moment. Trossard will definitely play in midweek because he can't play the weekend. To keep an eye on this, it's probably a lineup that I will change. For Villa, Bailey is fit, but he's currently starting their midweek game as I'm recording this. That could impact whether he starts at the weekend too. Bournemouth, not much to talk about there. As I said, for Brentford, I'm predicting them to start what I consider their strongest front three of Mbeumo, Shada and Carvalho. For Brighton, I expect Wifa will come back in central midfield, and I reckon João Pedro will come back into the lineup too, as I think Minter will as well. Chelsea, I think we're starting to get a little bit of clarity with the weekend, midweek switchovers, so they look very good in that game against West Ham. Gusto should be back fit. I expect him to come back in over the likes of Disasi and Toastin that we've seen slotting in there so far. Palace, not a huge amount to talk about there. Same for Everton. For Fulham, I finally yielded and put Raul Jimenez in there as the starting striker. For Ipswich, one small thing to note compared to potentially when we went through the squads and things in pre-season and when I did them the other week, is that O'Shea looks to have usurped Wolfenden as starting centre-back now. So I think we're now seeing the sort of set back four that we're likely to see for the foreseeable future. Not much to say for Leicester. Not much to say for Liverpool. City, this is very much a work in progress. So as it stands, I've got them playing a back four with Walker and Stones stepping out from centre-back into a number 6 position. Still got Savio and Doku on there. De Bruyne had some sort of injury. And then Foden and Bernardo Silva. Easily could be Gundogan in there for one of those positions too. We'll have to wait and see. For United, I've currently got predicted on paper what I consider to be their strongest 11. Now, whether Højlund's fit enough to start that game against Spurs, and whether Ugarte comes in, and whether Amad Diallo is dropped, remains to be seen. That is what I would consider as it stands. You could, Luke Shaw for Dallo, if he was fit, you could argue, but that's generally how I think United should be shaping up and where I see them heading. Newcastle, really not sure. I've gone for Barnes to be dropped because, the odds are that Barnes will be dropped. But they're really missing Botman. They really need... Burn at centre-back is not filling me with any confidence for them. We saw Trippier come in for that last game, but yeah, I think that's going to be a bit of a back and forth. So if that does become a bit of a back and forth, it pretty much negates either of them as being a decent draft asset, because you can't be holding Livramento or Trippier knowing that one of them could just get 10 minutes off the bench. For Forest, as I said, Ward-Prowse I think will kind of take over Morgan Gibbs-White duties with Yates and Anderson in there. For Southampton, I think they will play very similarly, if not exactly the same team that they played last weekend. I think that front three, we saw Fraser come in for that game. He didn't look particularly good. I found that quite an odd signing. The manager is a huge fan of Ross Stewart, so I could see it being something like Dibbling, Archer and Stewart, but we'll have to wait and see. And I think Lallana will continue to get in now. For Spurs, not a huge amount of surprises there either. Bentancur started over Basuma in the number 6 and looked pretty good. It's just whether or not that's meaty enough to go away to Old Trafford and do a job in there, particularly if they start with Ugarte and Mainu in there. I think we will need Basuma, but Ange is pretty stubborn, and if he thinks that's the most exciting way to play, it could be Bentancur again. West Ham needs to make some changes. I think Tadaibo will come in over Mavropanos. He didn't look particularly great alongside Kilman. I thought Emerson looked pretty poor, so I'm backing Wan-Bissaka to go and cover there at left back with Kufal coming in at right back. And I think as bad as he's played, I think Antonio will get a start over Bowen as number 9 because that just didn't work. And obviously Fulkrug is now injured with some sort of Achilles injury, so he's not going to be on the scene for a couple of weeks at least. And then Wolves in a bit of an injury crisis of their own. Santiago Bueno I expect to come in at centre-back in favour of Mosquera, who's injured. And those front players of Bellegarde, Strand Larsen and Cunha, with João Gomez and Lemina sitting just behind, I think is going to be pretty established now, and Andre as the very much central defensive number 6. So that is it for this episode. A reminder again, the waivers will process on Friday morning at 11 a.m. So get those penciled in ASAP so that you don't leave it till very last minute and start panicking at 10:58 trying to search for the players that you want. If you're a fan of the channel and of the videos, make sure you've hit the subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. Helps get the channel out there and helps you to not miss any future episodes as soon as they become available. And for those listening on the audio, please do the same. Follow us on whichever platform you're listening to so that you don't miss out on any future episodes as they drop. And your version of a thumbs up is to go and leave a review. Again, just helps get the podcast out far and wide. And as I've said before, more listeners means more resources, which means able to put more into this and create better content for all of you. For those of you that want a little bit more, you'll have also, of course, see me make reference to draftfc.co.uk. So if you're a big draft FPL player, there may be something we've got there of interest to you. Lots of exclusive features for signed up members, stuff you can't find anywhere else. And some of you that follow us on X will have also seen this week that I'm also currently in the process of setting up a members-only Draft FC Discord channel with the aim of sort of fostering the community a little bit more, because I'm aware that pretty much 99% of the conversations that I have with members at the moment is in one-to-one interactions, whether that's in comments or in direct messages through various channels. And I'd like it to have a lot more of a collegiate feel. I want it to be more of everyone helping each other. If it's only Draft FC members, then I know that everyone in that will have access to all of the same stats and can just really be a crutch for each other. And that goes for me just as well as any of you guys. There will be those of you out there who are members who support various teams, who have various insights and opinions and strengths, whether that's in the way you watch games, the way you analyse games, statistics, whatever it may be. I know that Draft FC members are obviously in a higher tier of commitment to draft, so I'm really excited to get that up and running. It should be up and running within a couple of weeks. So if that in itself is something you might be interested in, then just another reason to head to draftfc.co.uk and sign up. We'll leave it there for now because we've been going for a little while and it's getting quite late in the day. Best of luck for your moves ahead of Game Week 6. Leave any questions or comments below and I will get back to the majority of them. You can also follow and message us on X at draft_FC. But until next time, as always, stay sure.